Marcus Sterling adjusted his expensive Italian suit as he stepped out of his black Rolls-Royce. The morning sun reflected off the polished chrome, creating a blinding flash that made him squint. At 45, Marcus had built an empire from nothing, transforming a small tech startup into a billion-dollar corporation that dominated the global market. His company, Sterling Dynamics, had offices in 30 countries and employed over 50,000 people worldwide. Today was different from his usual routine. Marcus had been invited to attend a special ceremony at the Royal Palace, where he would receive a prestigious Business Excellence Award from the Queen herself. The invitation had arrived 3 weeks ago, printed on cream-colored paper with gold embossing that spoke of centuries of tradition. Marcus had immediately called his personal assistant to clear his schedule and arrange for his best suit to be tailored to perfection. The palace gates stood imposing before him, their iron bars decorated with intricate designs that had witnessed countless historic moments. Beyond the gates, manicured gardens stretched toward the magnificent palace building, its windows gleaming like jewels in the morning light. Marcus felt a surge of satisfaction as he approached the entrance. This award would cement his status among the business elite and open doors to even greater opportunities. 2 royal guards stood at attention beside the main entrance, their red uniforms pristine, and their posture perfectly straight. They had been standing there since dawn, trained to maintain their positions regardless of weather or circumstance. Their faces showed no emotion, their eyes fixed straight ahead as they had been taught from their first day of service. These men represented centuries of royal tradition, dedicated to protecting the monarchy and upholding the dignity of the crown. Marcus walked toward the entrance with confident strides, his leather shoes clicking against the cobblestone path. He expected the usual deference he received everywhere he went. In his world, people bowed when he entered boardrooms, restaurant staff scrambled to accommodate his every whim, and government officials treated him with the utmost respect. His wealth had created a bubble around him where everyone catered to his desires and few dared to challenge his authority. The first guard, James Morrison, was a 28-year-old man who had served the royal family for 6 years. He came from a modest background, his father having worked as a factory supervisor and his mother as a school teacher. James had joined the Royal Guard not for glory or recognition, but because he believed in service and tradition. He took pride in his duty and maintained the highest standards of conduct, even when faced with difficult situations or demanding visitors. As Marcus approached, he noticed that neither guard acknowledged his presence with the bow he expected. In his mind, his status as a successful CEO warranted immediate recognition and respect from everyone, regardless of their position or protocol. He had grown accustomed to people recognizing his importance the moment he appeared, and their failure to do so irritated him immensely. Marcus stopped directly in front of James and stared at him expectantly. Several seconds passed, but the guard remained motionless, following his training to maintain position unless specifically ordered otherwise or faced with a security threat. The palace protocol was clear about when guards could break their stance, and greeting visitors was not part of their duties during ceremonial posts. The businessman's face began to redden with anger. He had never been ignored in such a manner, especially not by someone he considered beneath his social standing. Marcus believed that his invitation to the palace automatically granted him special treatment from all palace staff, including the guards. His understanding of royal protocol was limited, based more on movies and television shows than actual knowledge of centuries-old traditions and procedures. Marcus cleared his throat loudly, expecting this obvious signal to prompt the appropriate response from the guard. When James continued to maintain his position without acknowledging the sound, Marcus felt his temper rising to dangerous levels. He was not accustomed to being treated as just another visitor, and the guard's apparent disrespect challenged everything Marcus believed about his own importance and status in society. The morning air grew tense as other visitors began to notice the standoff developing at the palace entrance. Some paused their conversations to observe the unusual scene, while others quickly looked away, sensing that something unpleasant was about to unfold. The beautiful palace grounds, usually filled with peaceful and respectful interactions, were about to witness an event that would shock everyone present and change multiple lives forever. Marcus stepped closer to James, his breathing becoming heavier with each passing moment. The expensive cologne he wore mixed with the crisp morning air as his anger continued to build. He had never encountered such blatant disrespect in his adult life, and the public nature of the situation made it even more humiliating. Several other award recipients had already entered the palace, their interactions with the guards proceeding smoothly and without incident. James could sense the tension building, but remained focused on his duty. His training had prepared him for various challenging situations, including dealing with difficult visitors who might not understand palace protocol. He had encountered demanding individuals before, but something about this man's aggressive posture and increasingly hostile demeanor set off internal warning signals. Still, James maintained his composure and continued following the strict guidelines that governed his behavior during ceremonial duties. The second guard, Thomas Wright, stood just a few feet away, also maintaining his position while keeping Marcus in his peripheral vision. Thomas was a veteran guard with 12 years of service, having worked through multiple royal events and ceremonies. He had witnessed various confrontations over the years, and could recognize when a situation was escalating toward potential violence. His muscles tensed slightly as he prepared to intervene if necessary. Though he hoped the situation would resolve peacefully, Marcus raised his voice, attracting more attention from nearby visitors and palace staff. His words carried across the courtyard as he demanded acknowledgement and respect from the guards. Several tourists stopped taking photographs to watch the unfolding drama, while palace security personnel began moving closer to assess the situation. The peaceful atmosphere of the royal grounds was being disrupted by one man's inability to accept that his wealth and status did not automatically override established protocol. Lady Catherine Pemberton, a member of the royal household staff, noticed the disturbance from her office window overlooking the main entrance. She had been working at the palace for 15 years and had never seen such aggressive behavior from an invited guest. Lady Catherine immediately reached for her phone to alert palace security about the developing situation, knowing that intervention might be necessary to protect both the guards and the reputation of the royal family. Marcus began gesturing wildly with his hands, his face now completely red with rage. He pointed at his expensive watch and mentioned his important business meetings, as if these personal concerns should somehow influence royal protocol. His voice grew louder as he listed his accomplishments and wealth, apparently believing that his resume would convince the guards to break their stance and show him the deference he demanded. James remained silent throughout Marcus's tirade, his eyes fixed straight ahead as he had been trained. The guard's calm demeanor only seemed to infuriate Marcus further, who interpreted the lack of response as additional disrespect. Marcus had no understanding that royal guards were specifically trained to remain neutral and unmoved by attempts at manipulation or intimidation from visitors, regardless of their social status or wealth. The morning sun climbed higher in the sky, casting longer shadows across the palace courtyard. More visitors continued to arrive for the ceremony, many of them pausing to observe the strange scene playing out at the entrance. Some recognized Marcus from business magazines and news articles, making the situation even more embarrassing for a man who prided himself on maintaining a polished public image. Palace Security Chief Robert Maxwell received Lady Catherine's alert and immediately dispatched 2 additional security officers to the main entrance. Maxwell had 20 years of experience in law enforcement before joining the palace security team, and he could recognize potential violence from the description he received. He grabbed his radio and began coordinating a response that would protect everyone involved while minimizing disruption to the ceremony. Marcus noticed the gathering crowd and felt his humiliation deepen. In his mind, these people were witnessing his inability to command respect from a simple palace guard, which challenged his entire self-image as a powerful and influential leader. His rational thinking began to deteriorate as his ego overrode his common sense, pushing him toward a decision that would have devastating consequences for his carefully constructed life. The businessman began to pace back and forth in front of James, his expensive shoes scraping against the cobblestones. His muttered complaints grew into audible threats about using his influence to have the guard fired or disciplined. Marcus apparently believed that his invitation to the palace gave him authority over the staff, demonstrating a fundamental misunderstanding of royal hierarchy and protocol that would soon lead to disaster. Thomas Wright exchanged a quick glance with James, a silent communication that conveyed their shared concern about the escalating situation. Both guards had protocols to follow if a visitor became physically aggressive, but they hoped the man would calm down before such measures became necessary. The beautiful palace grounds, designed to inspire peace and reverence, were about to witness an act of violence that would shock the nation and destroy a man's entire empire in mere seconds. Marcus suddenly stopped pacing and turned to face James directly. His eyes had taken on a wild look that concerned everyone watching from a distance. The businessman's hands were clenched into fists at his sides, and his breathing had become rapid and shallow. Years of always getting his way had created a man who simply could not process being denied or ignored, especially in such a public setting where his reputation was at stake. The palace gardens around them were filled with the sound of fountains and chirping birds, creating a peaceful contrast to the tension building at the main entrance. Other visitors continued to flow past the guards and into the palace, their interactions proceeding normally while Marcus remained stuck in his confrontation. Several attempted to catch his attention and suggest he simply proceed inside, but his focus had narrowed to the single guard who refused to acknowledge his importance. James could feel the man's intense stare, but maintained his professional composure. His training had taught him to remain calm under pressure and to never react emotionally to provocations from visitors. The guard had encountered difficult people before, but the level of entitlement and rage displayed by this businessman was unusual, even by palace standards. James hoped that security personnel would arrive soon to defuse the situation before it escalated further. Lady Catherine watched nervously from her window as the scene below continued to unfold. She had called security several minutes ago and expected them to arrive momentarily. The experienced staff member had witnessed many challenging situations during her years at the palace, but something about this particular confrontation felt different and more dangerous than usual. She began documenting the incident in case formal complaints or legal action resulted from whatever was about to happen. Marcus began pointing his finger directly at James's face, coming closer than protocol normally allowed. His expensive cologne mixed with the scent of his perspiration as his anger reached a boiling point. The businessman started speaking through gritted teeth, making threats about using his connections to destroy the guard's career and reputation. His words became increasingly personal and vicious as his self-control continued to deteriorate. The gathering crowd grew larger as more people noticed the disturbance. Some pulled out their phones to record what was happening, sensing that they might be witnessing something significant. Social media had made everyone a potential journalist, and the combination of a wealthy businessman and royal guards created an inherently interesting scenario for online content. None of them realized they were about to capture footage that would go viral within hours and destroy a man's life. Thomas Wright stepped slightly closer to his colleague, ready to provide support if the situation turned physical. His experience told him that the businessman was approaching a breaking point, where rational thinking would completely disappear. The veteran guard had seen similar patterns before in individuals who were not accustomed to being denied or challenged, and he recognized the warning signs that often preceded violence. Marcus raised his voice to a shout, demanding that James acknowledge his presence and show proper respect immediately. His words echoed off the palace walls, causing several birds to take flight from nearby trees. The businessman's face had turned purple with rage, and veins were visible on his forehead as his blood pressure spiked to dangerous levels. His entire body shook with fury as he prepared to take action that would forever change his life. Palace security officers finally appeared in the distance, moving quickly but carefully toward the main entrance. They had been trained to handle delicate situations involving high-profile visitors, while maintaining the dignity and reputation of the royal family. However, they were still several yards away when Marcus reached his breaking point and made a decision that would shock everyone present. James remained perfectly still despite the increasingly aggressive behavior from the businessman. The guard's calm professionalism in the face of such hostility impressed the watching crowd and would later be praised by his superiors. His commitment to duty and protocol remained unwavering, even as he sensed that the situation was about to turn violent. The young guard had no idea that his restraint and dignity would soon be rewarded in ways he never could have imagined. The morning air seemed to crackle with tension as Marcus drew back his right hand. Time appeared to slow down as several people in the crowd realized what was about to happen and gasped in shock. The beautiful palace grounds, steeped in centuries of tradition and respect, were about to witness an act of violence that would send shockwaves through the business world and social media platforms around the globe. Marcus Sterling, CEO of a billion-dollar corporation and recipient of numerous business awards, raised his hand with the full intention of striking a royal guard who had simply been following protocol and doing his duty with honor and dignity. The slap echoed across the palace courtyard like a gunshot, causing dozens of people to gasp and step backward in shock. Marcus's hand connected with James's cheek with such force that the sound seemed to hang in the air for several seconds. The young guard's head snapped to the side from the impact, but he maintained his footing and quickly returned to his original position, showing remarkable composure despite the assault. Several phones captured the moment from different angles, the footage already being uploaded to social media platforms before Marcus even realized what he had done. The businessman stood frozen for a moment, his hand still raised as if he couldn't believe his own actions. Reality began to crash down on him as he saw the horrified expressions of everyone around him and heard the shocked murmurs spreading through the crowd. James touched his cheek briefly, feeling the sting where Marcus's hand had struck him. The guard's training kicked in immediately, and he began following protocol for handling physical assault by a visitor. Despite the pain and humiliation, James maintained his dignity and professionalism, which only served to make Marcus's behavior appear even more outrageous to the watching crowd. Thomas Wright immediately stepped forward, positioning himself between Marcus and James while signaling for palace security. The veteran guard's protective instincts had activated, and his expression showed barely controlled anger at seeing his colleague attacked. However, Thomas also maintained his professional composure, knowing that any retaliation would only make the situation worse and could reflect poorly on the royal guard's reputation. Lady Catherine dropped her phone in shock as she witnessed the assault from her window. In her 15 years at the palace, she had never seen a visitor strike a guard, and she immediately began documenting every detail of the incident for the formal report that would be required. She knew that this event would have serious legal and diplomatic consequences that would reach the highest levels of palace administration. Marcus suddenly realized the gravity of what he had done as he saw the crowd's reaction and noticed the security officers running toward him. His face went pale as the adrenaline began to wear off and rational thinking returned. The businessman started looking around frantically, as if searching for an escape route or some way to undo his actions. His expensive suit suddenly felt heavy and restrictive as sweat began to pour down his face. The first palace security officer reached the scene and immediately took control of the situation. Officer Martin Hayes had 20 years of experience in law enforcement and knew exactly how to handle an assault on palace grounds. He positioned himself next to Marcus while his partner attended to James, following established protocols for protecting both the victim and the perpetrator while gathering evidence. Marcus began stammering apologies and explanations. His earlier arrogance completely evaporated. He seemed to understand for the first time that his wealth and status would not protect him from the consequences of his actions. The businessman's hands shook as he tried to explain his behavior, but his words came out as incoherent babbling that only made him appear more guilty and unstable. The crowd that had gathered to watch the confrontation now stood in stunned silence, many of them still recording with their phones. Several people were already sharing the footage online, adding hashtags and commentary that would soon make the incident trend on multiple social media platforms. Marcus Sterling's name was about to become infamous around the world for all the wrong reasons. James maintained his professional demeanor, even as paramedics arrived to check his injuries. The young guard answered their questions clearly and calmly, showing no sign of anger or desire for revenge despite having been assaulted in front of dozens of witnesses. His mature response to the situation would later earn him praise from the Queen herself and lead to opportunities he never could have imagined. Officer Hayes began reading Marcus his rights while his partner called for backup and additional security personnel. The palace had specific protocols for handling crimes committed on royal property, and assault on a royal guard was considered a particularly serious offense. Marcus's invitation to the award ceremony was immediately revoked, and he would be banned from all royal properties pending the outcome of legal proceedings. Marcus looked around desperately at the crowd of people filming him, finally understanding that his reputation and career were being destroyed in real time. The businessman who had spent decades building his empire was watching it crumble in a matter of minutes, because of one moment of uncontrolled rage. His expensive suit and luxury car suddenly seemed meaningless as he faced the reality of his situation. The beautiful palace grounds, which had been peaceful and serene just minutes earlier, were now filled with security personnel, paramedics, and curious onlookers. The incident had disrupted the entire morning ceremony, with other award recipients being redirected through alternative entrances, while the main entrance remained closed for investigation. Marcus Sterling's quest for recognition and respect had instead resulted in disgrace and legal consequences that would follow him for the rest of his life. Within 30 minutes of the incident, videos of Marcus slapping the royal guard had been shared thousands of times across social media platforms. The hashtag #SlappedRoyalGuard began trending on Twitter, with users expressing outrage at the businessman's behavior and praising James for his professional response. News outlets picked up the story immediately, with major television networks interrupting their regular programming to report on the shocking assault at the palace. Marcus found himself in handcuffs, being led away from the palace grounds toward a waiting police vehicle. The man who had arrived that morning expecting to receive a prestigious award was now facing criminal charges for assault and battery. His expensive suit was wrinkled and stained with perspiration, and his perfectly styled hair had become disheveled during the arrest. The contrast between his earlier confident demeanor and his current defeated appearance was stark and humiliating. James was taken to the palace medical facility for a thorough examination, though his injuries were minor. The young guard's calm and dignified response to the assault had impressed everyone who witnessed it, including senior palace officials who were already discussing how to properly honor his professionalism. The red mark on his cheek would fade within hours, but the respect he had earned would last a lifetime. Sterling Dynamics' stock price began plummeting as news of their CEO's arrest spread through financial markets. Investors who had trusted Marcus with their money were horrified to see him displayed on every news channel being arrested for assaulting a royal guard. The company's board of directors held an emergency meeting, knowing that immediate action was required to protect the business from further damage caused by their leader's behavior. Meanwhile, Marcus sat in a holding cell at the local police station, finally understanding the full scope of what he had done. His expensive watch and jewelry had been confiscated during booking, and he wore standard jail clothing that made him look like any other criminal. The businessman, who had been accustomed to luxury hotels and first-class treatment, was now experiencing the reality of the justice system like any other citizen. Sarah Mitchell, Marcus's personal assistant, watched the news coverage in her office with growing horror. She had worked for him for 8 years and had never seen him behave so irrationally. Sarah immediately began fielding calls from reporters, board members, and concerned employees, trying to manage a crisis that seemed to grow worse by the hour. She knew that her boss's career was effectively over, and she began updating her resume while watching his empire crumble on live television. The Queen herself was briefed on the incident within hours of its occurrence. Her Majesty expressed concern for James's well-being and appreciation for his professional conduct under difficult circumstances. Palace officials assured her that the guard was uninjured and handling the situation with admirable maturity. The Queen requested that James be given special recognition for his service and suggested that his example could serve as a model for training future guards. Marcus's wife, Catherine Sterling, learned about the incident from a friend who had seen the viral video on social media. She rushed home from her charity luncheon to find reporters camping outside their mansion, shouting questions about her husband's behavior. Catherine had no answers for them, as she was as shocked as everyone else by Marcus's actions. The woman who had enjoyed the benefits of her husband's wealth and status was now facing the consequences of his choices. The businessman's legal team arrived at the police station within hours of his arrest, but even they seemed stunned by the severity of the situation. Marcus's lead attorney, Robert Jameson, had handled corporate disputes and financial cases for years, but assault charges were outside his expertise. He immediately began searching for a criminal defense specialist while explaining to Marcus that his actions had created a legal nightmare with international implications. News outlets around the world picked up the story, with many focusing on the contrast between Marcus's wealth and privilege versus James's dignity and professionalism. Editorial writers and social media commentators used the incident to discuss broader issues of entitlement, respect, and the behavior expected from business leaders. Marcus Sterling had become an international symbol of everything wrong with corporate culture and unchecked privilege. Back at Sterling Dynamics headquarters, employees gathered around television screens and computer monitors, watching their company's reputation being destroyed in real time. Many began updating their LinkedIn profiles and reaching out to contacts at other companies, knowing that their association with Marcus Sterling would make finding new employment more difficult. The workforce that had once been proud to work for the successful entrepreneur now felt embarrassed and concerned about their futures. James returned to his quarters at the palace, where his fellow guards greeted him with support and admiration. Word of his professional conduct had spread throughout the palace staff, and many came to check on his well-being and express their respect for how he had handled the situation. The young guard who had simply been doing his duty had become a hero overnight, while the wealthy businessman who had attacked him faced the destruction of everything he had worked to build. The board of directors at Sterling Dynamics held an emergency vote and unanimously decided to remove Marcus as CEO effective immediately. The company's stock had lost 40% of its value in a single day, and major clients were threatening to cancel contracts due to the negative publicity surrounding their leader. Board Chairman William Harrison announced the decision to the media, stating that the company could not be associated with such behavior and that they were committed to rebuilding their reputation under new leadership. Marcus spent his first night in jail on a narrow cot, staring at the ceiling while contemplating how his life had changed so dramatically in just 24 hours. The man who had slept in luxury hotels around the world was now listening to the sounds of other inmates and trying to process the reality of his situation. His bail hearing was scheduled for the following morning, but even if he was released, he knew that his old life was gone forever. James received a personal visit from the Queen's private secretary, who delivered an invitation for the young guard to meet with Her Majesty later that week. The message indicated that the Queen wanted to personally thank James for his service and discuss potential advancement opportunities within the royal household. The guard who had been simply doing his duty was about to receive recognition that would change his career trajectory in ways he never could have imagined. Media coverage of the incident continued to dominate news cycles around the world. Television programs analyzed the video frame by frame, bringing in experts to discuss everything from anger management to corporate culture. Marcus Sterling's name became synonymous with entitled behavior and the abuse of power, while James Morrison was praised as an example of dignity and professionalism under pressure. Catherine Sterling found herself trapped in her own home by reporters and photographers who wanted comments about her husband's behavior. The woman who had enjoyed charity galas and society events was now hiding behind closed curtains, afraid to venture outside. Her phone rang constantly with calls from friends and acquaintances, some offering support, but many simply seeking gossip about the scandal that had engulfed her family. The legal consequences for Marcus continued to mount as prosecutors decided to pursue the case aggressively. Assault on a royal guard was considered a serious crime, and the public nature of the incident made it impossible to resolve quietly. His lawyers warned him that he could face significant jail time and substantial fines. In addition to the civil lawsuits that were already being prepared by various parties, Sterling Dynamics' new interim CEO, Victoria Chen, faced the enormous task of rebuilding the company's reputation and reassuring clients and employees. She immediately implemented new policies regarding executive behavior and corporate responsibility, hoping to distance the company from Marcus's actions. However, several major contracts had already been canceled, and the company's value continued to decline as investors lost confidence. James's story began inspiring people around the world who admired his restraint and professionalism in the face of such unprovoked aggression. Social media campaigns emerged celebrating his dignity, and several organizations reached out to offer him speaking opportunities and endorsement deals. The young man who had simply been doing his job had become an unexpected role model for grace under pressure. Marcus's business empire, which had taken decades to build, continued crumbling at an alarming pace. Banks began calling in loans, investors demanded their money back, and regulatory agencies launched investigations into his company's practices. The businessman who had once been featured on magazine covers as a success story was now the subject of articles about spectacular falls from grace. The incident sparked broader conversations about wealth, privilege, and accountability in society. University business schools began using the case as an example of how personal behavior could destroy corporate value. While psychologists analyzed the mentality that led successful people to believe they were above normal social rules, Marcus Sterling had inadvertently become a cautionary tale that would be studied for years to come. Back at the palace, James continued his duties with the same dedication and professionalism he had always shown. His fellow guards looked up to him even more after witnessing his response to the assault, and his superiors were already discussing promotions and special assignments. The young man who had been attacked for simply doing his job had emerged from the incident with his reputation enhanced and his future brighter than ever. Marcus's fall from grace was swift and complete, demonstrating how quickly a lifetime of achievement could be destroyed by a single moment of poor judgment. The businessman who had slapped a royal guard for not bowing would spend the rest of his life dealing with the consequences of those few seconds of uncontrolled anger, while the guard he had attacked would rise to heights he never could have imagined. 6 months later, Marcus Sterling sat in a small apartment he could barely afford, wearing clothes from a discount store instead of his former designer suits. The court had found him guilty of assault and sentenced him to community service, probation, and substantial fines. His divorce from Catherine had been finalized, with her receiving most of their assets as she distanced herself from his scandal. The man who had once commanded respect in boardrooms around the world now struggled to find any employment, as his name had become toxic in the business community. James Morrison, meanwhile, had been promoted to head of palace security training, a position that came with increased responsibility and respect throughout the royal household. The Queen had personally commended his service during a private ceremony, presenting him with a medal for exceptional conduct. His calm response to the assault had become a case study in professional behavior, and he was frequently invited to speak at training seminars for security personnel and public servants. Sterling Dynamics had managed to survive under new leadership, though the company remained significantly smaller than during Marcus's reign. Victoria Chen had successfully rebuilt relationships with several key clients and implemented ethical guidelines that helped restore confidence in the brand. However, the incident continued to serve as a reminder of how quickly corporate reputations could be destroyed by the actions of individuals at the top. Marcus spent his days volunteering at a homeless shelter as part of his community service, work that had given him perspective on the lives of people he had previously ignored. The former CEO found himself serving meals to individuals who had lost everything, many due to circumstances beyond their control. The experience humbled him in ways that his former wealth and success never could, teaching him about dignity that came from service rather than status. The viral video of the incident had been viewed millions of times and continued to circulate on social media platforms as an example of how not to behave. Business schools showed the footage to students studying corporate ethics and crisis management, while anger management courses used it to demonstrate the consequences of losing control. Marcus Sterling's momentary lapse in judgment had become a permanent part of internet history and educational curricula. James had used his newfound recognition to establish a scholarship fund for young people from modest backgrounds who wanted to pursue careers in public service. His story had inspired donations from around the world, with people admiring his grace under pressure and desire to help others achieve their goals. The guard who had been slapped for doing his duty was now helping create opportunities for the next generation of public servants. Catherine Sterling had moved to a different country to escape the constant reminders of her ex-husband's scandal. She had started over with a new identity and career, working for a small nonprofit organization that helped domestic violence victims. The experience of being married to someone whose anger could explode so suddenly had given her insight into the fear and helplessness that abuse victims experienced daily. Marcus's former business associates had all distanced themselves from him, unwilling to risk their own reputations by maintaining contact with someone whose name had become synonymous with entitled behavior and violence. The networking events and exclusive clubs that had once welcomed him now treated him as persona non grata, demonstrating how quickly social circles could close when scandal struck. The incident had sparked lasting changes in how businesses approached executive behavior and public relations training. Many companies implemented strict codes of conduct for their leadership teams and provided anger management resources for high-stress positions. The Sterling incident, as it became known, served as a wake-up call for corporate America about the importance of character and self-control among business leaders. James continued his duties at the palace with the same dedication and humility he had always shown. Despite his elevated status and recognition, he remained committed to service and protection, understanding that his response to one man's aggression had demonstrated the values that truly mattered in life. The young guard who had maintained his dignity while being assaulted had become a symbol of grace and professionalism that inspired people worldwide. As Marcus struggled to rebuild his life from nothing, he often reflected on the moment when everything changed. A simple expectation of deference from a palace guard had led to an act of violence that destroyed his empire and reputation in seconds. The businessman who had demanded respect through wealth and status had learned that true respect could only be earned through character and conduct, lessons that came too late to save the life he had spent decades building. The story of Marcus Sterling and James Morrison became a modern parable about pride, humility, and the consequences of our actions. One man's moment of uncontrolled anger had destroyed his life, while simultaneously elevating another man who had responded to aggression with dignity and grace. In the end, karma had indeed arrived within seconds, though its full impact would be felt for years to come.